Biden is going to come into office and take decisive steps to roll back some of the most egregious moves of the Trump administration. And he's going to take steps to move us forward. Across the course of the first week and a half in office, you're going to see him move on promises that he made on the campaign trail to ensure that we are focused on workers. You'll see him make good on his Buy American promise.
Well, that was President-elect Joe Biden's incoming White House Communications Director, Kate Bedingfield, praising the president-elect's plans for his first 10 days in office. You know, yesterday, the president-elect announced a slew of new executive orders on top of the $1.9 trillion coronavirus stimulus package and expansive immigration bill that he plans to enact. What else does he have in store? Charlie Hurd is with us, Washington Times opinion editor, also Fox News contributor. So, Charlie, what do you see as priority number one for the incoming administration?
Well, I think that we're getting a glimpse of it right now with all of the talk of trying to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord, with the effort to legalize the 11 million dreamers. Actually, I guess we don't really know for certain how many there are. But this is the problem, of course, with running a sort of stealth campaign, as Joe Biden did. When you become, you get elected, there isn't a clear mandate about what to do. And I think that and the problem for Joe Biden is that even with something like the Paris Climate Accord or the Iranian nuclear deal, if you were to poll Democrat voters, not Trump supporters, but Democrat voters, you wouldn't find, you wouldn't find either of those issues in the top 10 things that they would want done. So it's kind of a tricky situation. Of course, the other thing to remember is executive orders, whether they're done by President Trump or they're done by President-elect Biden, executive orders are always a reflection of a broken Congress. And because, obviously a lot of these things are things that should be done legally, done through the legislative process. And this is not a Democrat problem or a Republican problem. It's a bipartisan pox on both of their houses that neither party seems to be able to get any of these major issues done through the legislative process.
Yeah, he's going to need Republicans to come along on some of these. Let's take a look at the list. I mean, there is a slew of stuff that, as you just said, you've got the $1.9 trillion economic stimulus, amnesty for 11 million undocumented immigrants. As you said, rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, deal with the rollbacks that the Trump administration did on the environment. He's got the COVID vaccine blitz, a mask mandate the first 100 days, asking Americans to wear masks, dealing with gun liability for manufacturers, repeal the Trump tax cuts, expand the affordable health care, raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Let's start with immigration. 11 million undocumented immigrants. Do you think he can get something passed through Congress that legalizes or gives them a pathway to citizenship, as he is proposing?
Well, I think it's going to be very difficult, as President Trump's predecessor, President Obama, noted. For years, he personally did not have the authority to grant legalization to this group of people, and it's a very, it's a group of people who were brought into this country as minors by their parents. It's a very sympathetic group, and it's one of those things where I think that you could find some sort of way to a compromise between both parties to make something happen with this particular group of people. But it's like neither Democrats nor Republicans want to figure out a way to solve problems, which of course goes back to my point earlier, which is that in both parties there's this real anathema to actually solving problems in Washington, because for a lot of reasons, whether it's they want to raise money or they want to have talking points in a political fight, they don't want to solve problems because the problem helps them get reelected. And I think there's no clearer case than that than with illegal immigration, which has plagued this country now for 30, 40 years now, where Congress has failed to address a problem that voters do care a whole lot about.
Yeah, I think if you talk to individual Democrats and individual Republicans, they would say they do want to solve problems. The problem is the other guy. Right. They're always pointing fingers. Yeah, finally, exactly. Charlie, the great challenge now, the mood in the country, the extremism. what happened at the Capitol on January 6th, what does the president-elect, how does he address that? How does he deal with the disinformation and the blatant propaganda and lies and falsehoods that were spewed out about some of these issues and about the election? Critics say that a great swath of our country, they were brainwashed by what the president claimed and a false narrative. Can the president-elect bring us back together? How does he address that in a proper manner so we don't have a repeat of what we saw?
So, one of the most widely misunderstood things about the 2016 election is that it was all about issues. President Trump won in 2016 talking about issues that no politician in either party had talked about in a very long time. And while this list of executive actions that President-elect Biden wants to put into place, I don't agree with any of them. I think they're all crazy, and I think they're completely out of touch with Republicans and even with a lot of Democrats. I do commend him for the fact that he wants to talk about issues. And I think the way you bring the country back together is you focus on issues that actually matter to people. And one of those issues that actually matters to people is not impeaching a president 3 days before he is set to leave office anyway. And then they're talking about having a trial of a president who's already left office. That's not how you bring the country back together. And so if Joe Biden wants to do one thing to take a step in the direction of unifying the country, he would stand up to his own party and put an end to this nonsense. It's all vindictive, and it's an effort to silence President Trump, to overturn the next election. Really, all they want to do is prevent him from ever running again, and silence his supporters. And so that's the most important step President-elect Biden could do to take a step towards reunifying the country.
Well, as you know, Democrats and some Republicans say that is what's needed to deal with what we saw and the type of narrative that was wrong that we saw in the past. But that'll be debated, and we'll see what Mitch McConnell does in the coming weeks. Charlie Hurt, Washington Times Fox contributor. Charlie, always good to see you. Thank you.
Great to see you, Eric.